Patterson. I'm a professor here at the Perry Center, and I will be the moderator for today's Hemispheric Forum. We're very pleased to have a very distinguished panel of representatives to talk about a very sensitive topic in the hemisphere today, the level of corruption in many of the countries. A few administrative remarks before we get started. Please silence your cell phones if you haven't already, so we do not have any distractions. We are interpreting this event and broadcasting it downrange to about 20 countries and about a couple hundred students of ours in the Perry Center and other interested participants. So welcome to our online audience downrange. We're glad that you're going to be a part of this discussion. Our online audience can also submit questions during the Q&A session that will follow in the second half of the session by going on to the chat room, typing in your questions, and we have our Perry Center staff ready to relay those questions to our panelists. Okay? We're conducting this event under Chatham House non-attribution rules. This is a very sensitive topic. We want our panelists to speak very candidly about a delicate topic, and so we'd ask you not to cite anything they say here without their express permission. You have their biographies in the program for the Hemispheric Forum, but I am going to cover a couple quick highlights to point out some of their distinguished accomplishments. They're in alphabetical order on the panel table in front of me. First, to my immediate left is Ambassador Adam Blackwell, who's been in the Canadian Foreign Service for quite some time. He's currently serving as the Secretary of Multidimensional Security at the Organization of American States, a position that he's been involved with for a number of years, but specifically in that capacity since 2010. We're happy to have Ambassador Blackwell with his experience with us. To his left is Ms. Claudia Duma, who's the President and CEO of Transparency International USA. Many of you may know that as the organization that produces the Corruption Perceptions Index, which she's going to talk about today. She's had years and years of experience working on rule of law, anti-corruption efforts in both think tanks and NGOs and a number of others. Okay, she's worked for the U.S. Agency of International Development on as a senior rule of law advisor, and she has her Ivy League credentials as a law degree from Cornell University. Mr. Derek McCoy has come the furthest of the panelists. He's joining us from the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and he is an accomplished author, a professor at the university. He has recently published another edition of his book, Corruption, Law, Governance, and Ethics in the Commonwealth of Caribbean. For 7 years, he was the contractor general for the government of Jamaica. And so he was responsible for reviewing and approving all of the contracts that the government employed for the country. He's had a number of other important positions, either currently in them or in the past. Was the chairman of the Fair Trading Commission, the Anti-Dumping and Subsidies Commission, the Public Utilities Appeal Tribunal, and a number of others that you can read about in your flyer and your program. Thank you, Dr. McCoy, for coming so far. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Harold Trakunis, who's been part of our panel presentations and hemispheric forums in the past, a very distinguished academic career as the head of the National Security Affairs Department at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey for a number of years, and he currently he's a senior fellow and director of the Latin American Initiative at the Brookings Institution here in Washington, D.C. He's a graduate of Stanford University, born in Maracaibo, Venezuela, and raised in Caracas, so he has direct experience in the region. Notice the diversity of our panelists. They hail from academia, from think tanks, from government, from regional organizations and NGOs. So we will have a very diverse level of experience and perspectives on corruption as part of this debate this afternoon. This is we've asked them here to talk about what is a very delicate topic and a very important one. The timing of this panel is not by coincidence. There are a number of serious crises unfolding even as we speak in the hemisphere. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Earlier this year, millions of marchers took to the streets of Brazil to protest over the Petrobras scandal, in which reportedly billions of dollars were siphoned off from public funds in bribes and suspicious contracts. In Guatemala, in early May, on May 9th of this year, the vice president of Guatemala was taken out of office because of allegations of fraudulent enrichment. And as we speak today, the Congress is meeting, deciding whether or not to lift the immunity that the head of state, President Perez Molina, has, and put him potentially on trial on corruption charges as well. In the neighboring state of Honduras, President Juan Hernandez is also under fire for the same thing, and he's admitted to the use of $200 million of public funds for his his campaign, presidential campaign. In Chile, presidential Michelle Bachelet has also had her approval ratings plummet because of fraudulent enrichment scandal run by some of her family members, reportedly. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have the former Minister of Security, Jack Warner, who's also been arrested in the recent FIFA scandal about a month ago. And last but not least is certainly what's happening in Mexico recently. Sunday's escape of El Chapo from a high-security prison in the Altiplano prison is the latest blow in a series of bad public incidents for the President Peña Nieto and his administration. This follows last September's massacre of 43 students in Iguala, allegedly at the hands of the mayor of the town and his wife. The First Lady of Mexico was also under criticism for alleged $1 million payoffs for some housing that she gave benefits to certain contracts to. And in one of those protests, they actually tried to burn down the presidential palace. So this is a very timely topic, and we're excited to have our panelists talking about this topic. I'm going to organize this in 3 parts. We're going to have a series of directed questions that I will moderate. We're going to open it up to Q&A for the audience members, and then we're going to have a final wrap-up session where each of the panelists can speak about the issue. Let's get started. Transparency International defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. But there's lots of other elements, as we discussed just a few minutes ago, about corruption. So I'd ask our panelists, starting with Ambassador Blackwell, to unpack that a bit. What is corruption? How does it impact the citizens of the world, or more specifically in the Western Hemisphere?
Thank you, Pat. Thanks to the Perry Center, and thank everybody for the invitation and being here. You're right. It is a difficult, sensitive, complicated subject that needs to be unpacked. And I think the first thing I'd like to say is there is no country, culture, environment that is immune from corruption. I'm not proud to say it, but last year, they had to remove the mayor of Montreal for a construction corruption scandal. I like to unpack corruption by saying there are 4 pieces to this, or there's 4 components to this. There's the corrupt, the corruptors, there's impunity, and there's tolerance. And I think if we try and deal with these in those various components, it's a little easier to start to deal with. Because I don't think of corruption as just this massive corruption on the industrial scale led by the president of a country. I think it's much deeper and much more profound than that. Losing legitimacy, respect, trust in your police because, they're trying to fleece you for whatever they can take because they're not being paid enough. And I think that's the other kind of the corrupt. There's 2 kinds. There's corrupt from greed, and there's the corrupt of need. And we also need to look at, are we paying our public services and servants enough to, protect them, if you will, from the temptation of being corrupt? Are there the checks and balances? Transparent institutions have been constructed to, provide oversight to those who are tempted by greedier instincts. If we look at the corruptors, where's the private sector? How are they working? They're the folks who are trying to get the construction contracts. How are we applying, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and how are we providing the checks and balances, and how are we working with the private sector to ensure that they aren't playing into this game? And are there tools like, for example, zero latency customs? In other words, there's no customs processes. Or are we looking at initiatives like, ease of doing business in a particular jurisdiction? You can bet your bottom dollar that if there are 52 processes to open a business, each one of those is going to cost you something. And for me, that's one of the first triggers that there's a problem in this corruptor kind of system. And I think impunity, obviously, as we've seen in Guatemala, the CICIG situation and being able to try and bring some symbolic cases to the courts or to justice is very important demonstration of this. And I think then the fourth piece, which really depends on us all, is not tolerating this. And, you know, there are campaigns in India, there's campaigns in other countries using cell phones, using social media to outline and capture photos of those who are trying to collect a bribe. And I think that the really difficult thing for us in many of the countries in our region is to move beyond this tolerance. And if we can break that chain of tolerance, then I think we're going to be able to move up the food chain and capture some of the bigger fish. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Duma?
Let me see if I can put about, I agree with everything.
Touch your microphone button there.
When Transparency International uses the phrase use of entrusted, that's an interesting definition, and entrusted is very deliberate. There are other definitions that will talk about official power. Entrusted is developed, is intended to pick up both private sector, potentially, could be an NGO sector, can be government, so it is not limited to government. So I think there's an interesting observation there when one looks at, and there are many different formulations of corruption, but this one is intended to permit broader than just official governmental corruption. It is also, when we're talking about what's in it, how do we unpack it? The first thing most of us think about is bribery. That clearly would be one phenomenon or one type of corruption that falls within this. But certainly the concept is not intended to be limited to bribery. One can talk about embezzlement. One can talk about kickbacks. One can talk about nepotism. There are a whole host of different behaviors. I can list as many as 30 of them if I'm going on a good day. That we might put in this definition. So I think when one talks about bribery, about corruption, what are we talking about? It may not just be bribery, while that clearly is one of the most prevalent, one of the most devastating manifestations that we see. Two thoughts further. One is, are we talking high level, where we see the largest amount of impunity? And impunity, I think, is a terrific word, and one I'm glad has been brought out at the very beginning. But it can also be what we call administrative, a lower level corruption. Often those administrative items can be very highly organized, and they may link into what's going on at a higher level. And I guess the last point I would leave is, and it's an area that we're having increasing more conversations in some of the circles I spend time, is what are the enablers of corruption? One of them is thinking what is happening across borders that incents the corrupt to take the actions they can. The ability to flow funds around the world, to use anonymous companies, to use banking systems, to acquire luxury goods, expensive condominiums in New York City, London, elsewhere. So I think there's a cross-border piece that many of us are becoming more focused on in thinking about how do we stop the impunity and what actions do we take.
Dr. McCoy?
I think we're in danger of just a continuous agreement with each other, which is going to make this a very boring presentation, because we all seem to share the same idea. I find the transparency definition of corruption useful, because it highlights something which the agency characteristic of what we're talking about, that we're really speaking about misbehavior of agents. But there's a danger here. There's a danger in that when we speak about it in the literature today, or the press, we tend to be looking for an essential definition, one phrase or term that captures it all. And we tend not to agree that we're talking about a construct. Corruption is something we make up. We decide what corruption is, and it's multidimensional, it's multifaceted, and it means many things to many people. It means things over time. It means what we would describe as corruption 40, 50 years ago is not what we're thinking about now. Our sense of what is right and wrong has in effect changed. I've always thought, that bribery is a good proxy for corruption. If you forget the niceties, if we just look at that, we capture, I think, much of what we're concerned about. But we are concerned about other things. We're concerned perhaps about nepotism and cronyism, what we do. You wouldn't have been too worried about in the past. We're concerned now about how private companies, treat money that is really private, but so broadly spent that the state has to be interested. We're worried about what I hear Americans call banksters, I think is the term I hear you using. So that has changed. We're now concerned perhaps about just governance in general. So we're seeing the concept of corruption evolving into a multidimensional, a complicated concept. Years ago, the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption decided to sort of look for a solution. It says, well, let's not pretend we fully understand it. Let's speak about acts of corruption. Begin to put under that things we think we ought to depreciate. And maybe that's the solution. We ought not to be looking for an essential definition, but begin to itemize a list of things, if it's 30 or whatever you're concerned about, maybe one in mind, because I'm worried about bribery. But you look for the things you're concerned about and say, these are things we want to address. The question then is, how do we address it? How do we treat with this what we suggest is a complicated, evolving issue? Especially let me confess, I speak from the point of view of the English-speaking Caribbean. I know nothing about Latin America. My friends will say I know too little about the English-speaking Caribbean as well, but never mind. But I speak from the perspective of the English-speaking Caribbean, where we are concerned about functional bureaucracies and bureaucracies that don't seem to work very well, or bureaucracies that seem to be too expensive for our needs, and therefore we have to find some way in which we can address it. My thoughts, I don't appreciate the need and desire, in fact, to get institutions that will, in fact, address this issue. But I think we ought to probably spend some more time on trying to promote transparency, which is not as expensive, as costly as some of the other things we've been trying to do. So, in summary then, I think we can't find an essential definition. We recognize that there are many component parts that we are concerned about, and perhaps if we had more transparency, we wouldn't have so much trouble. Thank you.
Dr. Kunis.
Well, thank you again to the Perry Center for inviting me to join this very distinguished panel. And I have to agree with Dr. McCoy. I think we're going to be in violent agreement throughout most of the day at the way things are going so far. Let me just make a couple points, since I do agree with my colleagues on many of the issues they've raised. I do think it makes sense to think of sort of types of corruption by the effects that they have. In the sense, there's a type of corruption I think about where somebody is persuaded, bribed, compensated in some way to do their official function, their government function, but just to do it faster or to give priority to somebody. This is sort of often the corruption of overregulated societies where people are trying to get things done and basically pay for priority. And a lot of this has to do not just with issues, I think, of the corruptors and the corrupted, but also the legal structures and institutions and what we choose to construct and define as legal and illegal. Because ultimately, I think Dr. McCoy is pointing to this, that's a definition that sort of societies and states and governments put in place. And that can shape, I think, the kind of corruption that we see. But the other thing is a kind of corruption that involves getting public officials to do the wrong thing, to make the wrong choice, to pick somebody who's not the lowest bidder on a government contract, for example. And I think that kind of corruption can be especially corrosive of social trust in institutions, one of the issues that Ambassador Blackwell was pointing to at the beginning of this conversation. So I try to at least think of these two different dimensions of corruption, and there are probably other ones, as a way of kind of organizing my thinking on this. The other thing, I think, to pick up on something that Ms. Dumas said, is this issue of enablers. And there is certainly a social component. After all, we have to remember that in most states, in most societies, there's not a policeman on every corner. There's not constant surveillance. Rules are followed because they're built in. People agree to follow them because they think they're right. So there is that element of dealing with the social dimension of corruption. But then there's also the institutional dimensions of corruption. This is the way we design the rules, how complicated we make certain interacting with certain government processes, how we structure the payments and salaries of public servants, and issues of transparency and accountability. I think I do agree that transparency is a very important part of how you fight corruption. And finally, I would just point to, especially because it's an issue for a number of states in the region, that the kind of state, the nature of the state, has a lot to do with corruption, and particularly states that where the government receives a great deal of income from sources such as natural resources, for example, where these resources flow to the government rather than to private individuals or corporations, creates another sort of risk, in which people become oriented towards the government as the way to access wealth. And therefore, that creates another dynamic that you see, especially, for example, in oil states, but is a risk, I think, in almost any state where there's a large amount of government income from a very small source, maybe even a source that's controlled and owned by the government. So I'd lay those out there as some enablers.
Great. Thank you. It sounds like we're in agreement that it's a multifaceted problem with many dimensions and many aspects, political, economic, and so on. Here's the second question, and we'll start with Ms. Duma in this case. In the examples that I cited at the beginning of the forum, these are very senior level problems that are within the countries of the Western Hemisphere right now. Where do anti-corruption practices begin for that level of a problem? Does it come from a popular movement on the grassroots level? Does it come from members of civil society, from the press, or from watchdog organizations and NGOs? Does it have to come from within the government itself, or even higher, does it have to come from the international community establishing rules and regulations and placing sanctions on the people who abuse these practices?
If I knew the answer to that definitively, I don't think we would have corruption sitting here, and whoever figured it out would have had the Nobel Peace Prize by now. I think all of the pieces that you touch on are parts of what we can talk about, is playing into thinking about corruption. Institutions have a role when we're talking about commercial institutions and the business community. We have officials, we have civil society. From where I sit now, Transparency International, we have a focus on this as a civil society social role, and it is partly my agreement with Dr. McCoy in being boring, the importance of transparency, the importance of accountability. Impunity at the top is a challenge. It is a serious, serious challenge. And I think in any given case when we're talking about corruption as an issue, it's helped us step back and say, what are we talking about? What are the specific issues that are most prevalent? What's enabling those? We have to start bringing down the phrase a little bit to say, what are the biggest issues in a society? Part of it does come from a moral compass, and I think that's a very important part of this. It's a willingness to say, it's time to act a certain way and think about what reforms need to be undertaken, what behaviors need to be done. But we need to be specific.
Great. Dr. McCoy, care to comment?
Again, we're carrying the common theme that these things are all important. It's like vital organs. Which one is more vital? They're all critically important. We're not going to achieve any progress until we reconcile all of these things. My interest, of course, is with government, with public bureaucracies, and how they work. And part of the problem we have with the corruption in a bureaucracy. My colleague to my left mentioned earlier that part of the issue we worry about is when we have persons who are induced to do what they're paid to do. And why would you have that? I mean, we have it because we have, my part of the world, we tend to develop public bureaucracies and make them monopolies. We tend to put them in charge of things. They become gatekeepers. You can't find alternatives. You must deal with the government. You can't get a birth certificate from somebody else. You can't prove you're married by going someplace else. You have to go through the public records. You can't, in my system, where I live, we have what is called a torrent system of land administration. So we have a government guaranteed title. You can't get that except going through the state. And therefore, these are not things that we have yet found ways of discipline by the market. If I have a choice between choosing services from someone who is corrupt and someone who is not, someone who is efficient and someone who is not, I'll choose the efficient, non-corrupt one. Unhappily, of course, government is distrustful. And we are distrustful of government who wants to put too many of these things out to competition. So in a sense, the difficulty we have, especially in small societies, is the inability to have the market discipline some of our transactions. If you could have that, then things probably would be a little bit more efficient. The civil society is becoming important. largely again because they tend to be they don't demand too much money. They tend to there's also sweat equity in what takes place. In my own case, things like the NIA, National Integrity Action, or Jamaica for Justice. People put their efforts into that, and that sometimes works. I want to make another point, however, about the transparency issue, if I may. There's I think a trend, and again I speak for the Caribbean. When we look at the corruption issue, we we start from the perspective that we need better values. We've spoken about that. I must confess, for quite a while, I depreciated that. I felt we needed better bureaucracies, but that's a different point of view. But if you're trying to have better bureaucracies, you have to address this really critical issue. How do we pay for them? How do we get the resources to make an efficient, responsive bureaucracy? And it's against this background that transparency has value, because sometimes with transparency, we don't need big bureaucracies. We just need a regulation or a law that says your information is open to the public. And that may very well be the solution.
Okay. Dr. Contreras.
Thank you. I think that there's a point I agree that transparency and accountability are very important components of the solution for the kind of corruption you're pointing to. And I want to just talk a minute about why we talk about them together. Because I think when you put them together, what you're essentially getting is a way of dissuading people from engaging in bad behavior. I mean, the combination of availability of information through transparency and the prospect of punishment is what creates dissuasion in those cases where sort of the moral compass fails to point the right way. So I think it's how do we dissuade people from engaging in this kind of behavior at the very top? Part of this, I think, obviously goes to all the formal rules, the constitutional rules, the court system, et cetera. But there's other structures that need to be in place that, unfortunately, are weaker in some countries than in others. Let me just point to at least three. One is the role of party systems. We usually think of political parties in the region as being institutions that have become weakened across time. Oftentimes, if you look at public opinion polls, most people, political parties rank near the very bottom of the popularity when it comes to public opinion. But parties have an important role of disciplining politicians. Parties are brand names. And to the extent that politicians care about the brand that they're advertising, then they should care about the probity of the members of the party. Unfortunately, I think because of the weakness of party systems in many parts, that has broken down. Parties don't necessarily do the job they're supposed to do of regulating the behavior of their members. So this is not only a government function, this is also a function for parties. In part, this, I think, has to do with campaign finance systems, which across the region often lack transparency and accountability. Now, this is not a permanent condition. Countries can and do make changes to their system, and I think those of us who have observed Mexico's new, INE, the electoral authorities, as it's been currently reformed, have seen a great deal of progress being made there. Certainly not enough to deal with every issue related to political corruption in that country, but still great progress over previous times. And finally, in terms of accountability, I think social changes make a difference. The Hemisphere is a region where across the last 10 or 15 years, we've had the good fortune that in many countries, poverty has gone down and middle classes have expanded. And middle classes, by their nature, need for government to work efficiently for them. They need them to provide effective policing, transportation, education, public health. They're neither so wealthy that they can pay for it themselves, as many in the region who are wealthy can, nor are they so poor that they can be addressed through sort of the public welfare systems or ignored, as unfortunately is the case in too many countries. So middle classes tend to push on political systems and to become activated by issues such as corruption. So when we see today the incidents that you point to, we should also remember that there's social change going on in the region and emerging classes of persons who expect a different standard of behavior and have more ability to make their voices heard than might have been true in the past.
Great. Ambassador Blackwell, care to comment?
Look, I think I would add to the chorus here of I agree. It's all of the above to your list. I just mentioned two that we haven't focused on: the press or the media and their role in driving more transparency, real transparency, helping us develop what I call a culture of evidence. But I would also say that technology and social media is a tool that can be, will be, and should be exploited even more to enlist all of us in trying to eliminate corrupt practices. And frankly, I like the way Harold put it, drive what I would call good behavior. I mean, this isn't all negative. We want services and public services that work, and we should reward those that are providing those services and whitelist them, as some might say, and also challenge those who aren't. So, how do you drive those good behaviors? I think is a really important point here.
Let's talk about political will. We're dancing around this topic a little bit about the levels of accountability and transparency that are required. In the audience today, we have a lot of representatives from Caribbean nations. In some cases, they don't have a very robust civil society developed. The press works well in these countries, but there may not be the congressional oversight that's also required. How do we generate political will? And Dr. McCoy, if you could speak from your experience as the Contractor General of Jamaica for 7 years, how do we generate political will at that level so that our senior leadership, in particular, self-govern themselves?
Maybe it's about time we stop, be nice to each other. Since
Okay.
Harold and I are the two academics here, perhaps we can bare our souls and address some of the controversies or issues that divide us. There's a sense we're not too sure how we value political competition and how we value political parties. I mean, in my own experience, the two predominant scholars in my own country, my own field, seem to thinks that we just have too much competition. Okay. In the party level, other feel we don't have enough, and they're both important voices in it. A very important and topical issue back home for me now is campaign financing. In your own jurisdiction, I think you are concerned about the importance or the influence of private financing on your political process. And it's kind of interesting, the debates you have here filtered out to us as well, and we have similar debates. And one of the solutions that is one solution being contemplated back home is that really campaign finance should be publicly supported. And that disturbs me personally, because the effect of that, of course, is to entrench those who are already there. If you're already in the system, then you're pretty much sure of some support. If you're outside on the extreme, then you're not going to get campaign financing. I'm starting to wonder, in fact, if that could be a good thing if we set about just entrenching the old guard as to what it is. There is certainly the question of political will. There's a question of the commitment of our political leaders and our bureaucrats to really make the hard decisions, to turn their backs on their friends. It doesn't happen very readily. I mean, we have all sorts of misbehavior, or what we may argue is misbehavior, but our political leadership and our bureaucratic leadership are often afraid to say, you must face those consequences. You must face those consequences. It's an issue which arises earlier from what Harold has said earlier. He didn't use the term, but he really spoke about the moral hazard. The fact that no consequence follow the bad behavior. That's a real critical issue. We have to ensure that some consequence, whatever it is, whether it is imprisonment, whether you lose the political election, but some condign consequence must follow when you behave badly. And our challenge is to ensure that comes into effect. If you don't have important, severe, significant consequences of bad behavior, you will always have it.
So in some cases, there's no dissuasion, there's no deterrence from acting poorly.
Precisely.
Dr. Kutunis, do you agree that the human rights NGOs have wrestled with this for years in the hemisphere, and they've resorted in some cases to naming and shaming in order to put pressure upon leaders to comport themselves properly?
And I think that's a strategy that can work well when other institutions of government are able to then act on that information. I think one of the issues we have to take into account as we look at states in the hemisphere, and there's very many different types of democratic systems, each of them work slightly differently, but certainly in cases where the executive branch has accumulated a great deal of power, particularly in certain presidential systems, it can become extremely difficult to do this. I think in systems that where the checks and balances are operating somewhat better, perhaps in parliamentary systems, you have some more immediate political consequences, not just judicial consequences, for this kind of poor behavior. So, in a sense, I do think that civil society and the press is part of the answer to this issue.
Okay. Ambassador Blackwell, the OAS has developed an Inter-American Convention against corruption. Is that effective to put pressure upon the leaders in the region?
I mean, I think that the Inter-American Convention on Corruption does a very useful is a useful mechanism to try and outline what are the component parts in a national bureaucratic system to try and develop at least the checklist of initiatives that are important. I think that the weakness of the convention is it really looks at public corruption or the corrupt rather than looking at the corruptors. And I believe that that's one of the weaknesses that we have in trying to deal with this only through one or a single lens. And just to pick up on what my colleagues here were saying, a bit of a disagreement here. I personally believe that we're going to get further if we name and fame, or we whitelist, successful or good practices. And that's how we are going to encourage others to participate. That's how we're going to set the example. That's how we're going to create, I would hope, a groundswell of folks who want to participate in certain activities. I mean, give you one example. There's a construction company initiative. I've forgotten the name of it, where 5 of the largest construction companies in Mexico have pulled together and come to agree that they are not going to participate in any kind of illegitimate or illicit activity. And I think that that's the sort of thing that we need to start working on. Hopefully in Canada they'll do the same thing, because it's one of the areas that's, as they say in Spanish, preocupante. But we're going to get further by naming and faming rather than shaming. I think we need to make sure the courts are strong so that there isn't this sense of impunity, and work really the social networks to highlight these problems.
Ms. Duma, you've worked for think tanks and NGOs in this capacity. At the World Justice Project, you developed the Rule of Law Index, which my students cite quite a bit, and as well, even more reputable is the Corruption Perceptions Index from Transparency International.
What are they actually measuring, and what are they looking at? The CPI will give you a broad brush view of, and there is research that shows that perception data, if you get enough of it, can be pretty close to in fact. That has come out of the academy, out of academia. It's not going to tell you what you do about it. So we can say, and by the way, corruption is not just a problem that we're talking about for countries that are still working on strengthening certain institutions and developing them. If we look at the CPI, the United States is actually number 17, and it is the same rank as Barbados. It is below Canada. It is below Finland. So what do you do with this? I think the CPI has been very useful in some ways as a motivating factor. Transparency International gets questions. It's not effective enough yet. How do we improve our rank? And there's a lot of discussion that having done those rankings has an impact in getting attention. For those people who are familiar with the World Justice Project, it gives a lot of data, but there was a conscious decision made not to add it all up. It's another approach to constructing an index, but maybe not every data point is worth the same amount. So it's not just a matter of a scale of 100. So I think in answer to your question, indices are useful. they are tools. They can sometimes motivate. They can sometimes give information. They can give information to reformers for weak points may be, where opportunities may be. Importantly, they can also show where there's progress and trends. I think to the ambassador's point about positive, trends are critically important when we're looking at this space. But no individual index or tool is going to solve all of the questions and all of the analysis.
Thank you. Dr. Trincunas, a question for you. You've published widely on civil-military relations, and this morning in our Caribbean Defense and Security course, one of the questions was raised about the good coups recently in Africa, where in the cases of Burkina Faso and Burundi and even in Mali, the press is now reporting those as good coups. Military has risen up to overthrow corrupt governments. This is a very slippery slope in a region with a long history of military involvement in politics. Is this a risk in Latin America? Are we seeing a Central American spring, as one author wrote it? And if these mafia states, as Moises Naim has declared them, rise to power, what is the response of the military and the police forces who are sworn to protect the Constitution? And what should it be?
Well, I think you do raise the critical issue, which is whether there is such a thing as a good coup.
That's a great question.
A coup is usually a sign of severe institutional failure. So I'd be very suspicious of that kind of language. I think it's very short-sighted to describe a coup d'etat in that sense. I'd also raise some serious questions about whether in sort of a mafia state or a highly corrupted state, whether the military is really any different than the prevailing corrupted elite. Most of the mafia states that I know, the military is part of the corruption, and their rising up actually reflects the fact that somebody else in that elite has pushed them away from resources that they want. So this is rarely a case of the military having some sort of superior set of moral values in that kind of situation. However, I do think there is a broader problem with institutionality in many parts of the world when you're trying to deal with issues of corruption. And this is the issue of how do you empower the other institutions of government to be able to react to cases of high-level corruption or executive corruption? How do you empower courts and legislatures? How do they receive support from civil society and international actors? And here I do think that we have some models, certainly the work that the OAS has done in the Western Hemisphere, the work that institutions like CICIG have done in Guatemala, where external support to the prosecutors and the judicial system has been an important part of uncovering corruption there. The way that small groups of prosecutors can feel empowered by moral support or moral outrage from the population. What we see today in Brazil is not that there's a sudden increase in corruption in Brazil. Brazil has always had some level of corruption, nor is it a change in the laws, nor is it really a change in the system. Those are all in place. They've always had a federal police and a prosecutorial system that's professional. Now you have a group of prosecutors in Brazil that feels empowered by the support that they're receiving, the actions that they're pursuing in prosecuting corruption. So, I mean, how does these other parts of the state become empowered to address within the rule of law, within the Constitution, these issues? I think is really kind of where we should focus our attention.
Okay. Ambassador Blackwell, care to take that grenade?
Well, I mean, a good coup, according to whom?
That was a Washington Post article, in quotes.
No, but I mean, having been involved in these things, let me tell you, there's no such thing as a good coup and the interruption of the democratic process. And I don't think anybody in our hemisphere wants to go back there. And I think we should be very proud that we haven't. I would argue, as the other panelists have, that this is a multidimensional issue that needs strengthening of legislatures. We need to reduce the cost and transparency of electoral processes. We need to work with the private sector so that they understand and reflect their role. And frankly, let's not think of this just as a hemispheric issue. This is a global issue. And I'm working at the World Economic Forum as the chair of a council on the illicit currently. And what we're trying to do is come up with a very complicated matrix where we identify some pathfinder, if you will, elements of the illicit economy, and then we try and figure out and develop inventories of who's doing what in these areas, including with Get Label and Transparency International, and then to try and, like an accordion, shrink this thing so that we can actually go to those 2 or 3 initiatives where we're going to have high impact. So, I think that there's no such thing as an easy pathway here. Specifically for the Caribbean countries, one of the things that we haven't talked about and was very relevant, and I don't mean any disrespect to anybody here, but when I was meeting with your 15 or 16 chiefs of police, things like witness or whistleblower protection, because you live in very small communities where everybody knows each other. And it's very, very difficult to come forward and denounce corruption or an illicit practice. So simple things like figuring out how we're going to deal with witness protection and how we're going to work some of these things out. The other thing, I think, a role for the international financial institutions in terms of their lending mechanisms and their approach to this. And, free trade agreements. We're all talking about fast-track authority. Well, okay, here's an opportunity to try and raise the standards and raise our game and ensure that foreign corrupt practices will not be tolerated. So, to me, it's not one; it's all.
Okay, Ms. Duma.
I would agree. I think the whistleblowing is a good thing to call out and continue in agreement. I think ability to get government information, Freedom of Information Acts, are areas where there's opportunity to open up that piece is critically important when we're talking about the transparency and getting information out there, including on electronic databases. Fiscal information, how is money being spent, how are budgeting processes being done, how are procurements being handled, in terms of is there a competition, are the standards publicized, is the award posted, is the contract posted. These are the things that are going to schools, to roads, to the quality of life, at the same time that they can provide opportunities for tremendous amounts of funds to be siphoned. So I would make a continued plea on the importance of transparency, the importance of technology, and again, seconding on the notion of whistleblowing, Freedom of Information Act, critically important to be able to get at government information. The press was mentioned earlier, and I think that's a very interesting point when we look at the hemisphere. In the Caribbean countries, the press is actually pretty darn free. If one looks at some of the standards that are used, Freedom House does a report on freedom of the press. And if one looks at the Latin American countries, it is actually quite concerning to see where how low the press freedoms are and where there have been significant retrenchments, including with countries that have fairly consolidated power, such as Venezuela is just one to pull out. So I think we can say that we see a lot of correlation between freedom of expression, the ability of the press to do its work, and opportunities for corruption. So I think protecting that freedom of expression, that of assembly of the press is a very important part of what we're talking about today in this multidimensional phenomenon.
Thank you. Dr. McCoy, anything to add?
If I may, before I address this cycle, speak to something with the previous cycle, which I think is really important. We ought to be very careful how we get chuffed up about how we declare people and places to be corrupt, and what we think we're achieving with great respect to what TI is saying. You would have gathered from what I said earlier, I'm rather impressed with the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. You might have picked that up. And that convention recommended a number of things for the signatories. For example, it suggested having a broad definition of corrupt acts that you can begin to itemize. It has suggested that among those things you may wish to address are things like illicit enrichment as a crime, an offence, which incidentally on that precise clause the U.S. and Canada reserved, but that's another story. It addressed issues about agencies such as reporting agencies, taking reports about wealth and interest and assets and so on, and all English-speaking Caribbean territories, and pretty much I can't imagine any American territory has not signed that convention. They've all signed, and they intend to adopt that. So we have Antigua and Jamaica. Illicit enrichment is a criminal offence. In Jamaica, in Trinidad, you do have agencies which are set up as anti-corruption agencies, supposed to take a report from politicians and a whole host of public servants. Yet Antigua, Jamaica, and Trinidad, in TI's perspective, are fairly well-corrupt countries. Barbados, who has made no attempt to implement any of these things, is not. It's in the higher part of the scale. And you really wonder what you're achieving. I think the danger when we speak about the TI methodology is to confuse belief, with perception. Too often what we say is perception is belief. And we're not looking deeply. Not to suggest that perception and belief are not important things. Those important things. But they're not really good measurement of corruption. They're good measurement of what they say. It's a good measurement of belief, of perception, which may in fact be a measurement of belief. So somehow we have not fully grasped that. Now, TI produces an absolutely brilliant bribe payers index that you hardly ever see. But that's something that may very well give us a better view. If your interest is corruption, as a perception, that we can look at. To respond now to the current cycle, yes, we need to empower agencies, and in the Caribbean region, we are trying to do that. There's a tendency to create a body of institutions modeled after the Contractor General. They give other names and so on, but they function with the same way, which are significant investigatory powers, but they have to report to Parliament to carry it out. Now, there's a debate as whether that's good enough. I'm happy with that. I don't think you want to empower somebody too much and not have some control over them, and therefore the need to report and to have somebody else. But it is a conflict. We have an investigator that now investigates the police and is in constant dispute with our constitutionally empowered prosecutor. My predecessors, but rather my successors in my office. I don't think that having two institutions which are geared towards better governance, who do not agree, is itself necessarily a bad thing. We are making some steps. We understand the need for whistleblowing. One or two states have in the English-speaking Caribbean have taken steps. Jamaica has. Trinidad in a very different approach. But the problem we have is that there's many a slip between the cup and the lip. We say we want to achieve something, we don't necessarily achieve it. So the Jamaican legislation on whistleblowing is a very close copy of the UK legislation, which is virtually useless if you're being critical. It doesn't serve any function. It gives you some employment protection. But half the things we want to worry about are not concerned with employment at all. They've done what the Brits have done, and it really doesn't get a lot of complaints.
Let's start right over here. Ma'am, can you state your name, your country, where you're from, and just please keep your question to your comments, one question, and concisely, please, so we can have time.
Good afternoon to the panelists. Alana Wheeler. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I think the panelists touched on what I wanted to ask, really, but I just wanted to expand about whistleblowing. Right? My question is, who protects the whistleblower, and really, is it advisable for anyone to blow the whistle? Right? We have examples of Jean Miles in Trinidad and Tobago. That's back in the 1960s. She was a clerk in the public service, and she exposed a scandal that was operating with a minister of government. She went mentally off, and she was ill, and she eventually died very early. We have whistleblowers like Sybil Edmonds, FBI translator, Russell Tice from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and we have Ishmael Jones from CIA. All of them were fired. They were ostracized, punished, sidelined, victimized, and intimidated. So my question is it really worth exposing corruption?
Implementing whistleblowing legislation. It has. During the debate for the establishment of the anti-corruption committee that has been established there, the reporting committee, that issue arose. It didn't make the legislation. An amendment arose afterwards, which protects someone who reports to that commission. It's a very, very limited type of protection. The other example of whistleblowing, which is a little much broader, is the Jamaican example. But as I said earlier, it just repeats the English position. And what it says is that if you are an employee, only protects employees. If you're an employee and you report to the appropriate person, and it's a very fairly defined list, and the employer takes action against you, then that action would be protected against. And that is, one may argue, good, better than nothing, but hardly good enough. I mean, we have persons, who can blow the whistle, who are not in fact employed. Maybe more word, persons who are seeking employment. Students, I work in an academic institution. I think students know a hell of a lot more about, us than we think we'd like them to do. And the list goes on. So I am not sure that is a worthwhile solution. It's a solution, and we tick it off among the things we have achieved, but it doesn't really achieve a great deal. I used to count in the past how many persons applied in the UK. I've lost count. I can't get the data anymore. I don't know if anybody's ever complained in Jamaica on seeking protection on this law.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that whistleblowing is not the panacea that's going to solve all of this. But the one thing I have learned from having actually implemented a whistleblowing policy is you've got to study, do your homework. The whistleblower is protected, but also that the person who is being whistled on or whistled upon or whatever the expression would be has their protection and processes and due diligence protected as well. I mean, somebody embarks on a whistleblowing operation. In the Canadian government, I can tell you it's worked quite well and has exposed a number of serious incidents. And in some cases, I would say that the whistleblower has not been protected well enough. In other cases, it's worked as it should, but it's not something that's just I don't like my boss, so I'm gonna settle a score here. It needs to be, and whistleblowing policy needs to be extremely well understood and
citizen security, at least the first part of it. And I wonder, looking at that citizen security portion, if we could look at the institutional corruption related to security. I was recently talking with a number of Central American military folks, and they, without naming countries or anything like that, they would tell you that the reason that the militaries, at least in Central America, are involved in the security piece is because of the corruption of the police. Now, obviously, using the military in the in an anti-organized crime role has its own dangers and risks, but I wonder if you could talk about this piece. Is this a central piece to getting this right, to getting eliminating corruption in the police, the military? Is this a central piece to citizen security, or is it somewhere outside of that? Thank you.
Dr. Kunis, you want to tackle that first?
Well, I think we have to keep in mind that the link between corruption and citizen security is not necessarily a direct one. I mean, we have societies that are quite corrupt, that have relatively good levels of citizen security, and we have other societies where corruption and poor citizen security clearly go together. So we do need to draw a distinction between those two. The other thing we need to keep in mind is the issue of framing the citizen security in terms of the role of the military and the police is obviously something that's still being debated across the hemisphere. Certainly, you would want corruption in both of those services, I think, is problematic, just because they do control the preponderance of force that's available to the government and can be potentially misused, as we've seen in a number of cases in the hemisphere. That said, the issue, I think, when it comes to citizen security, we have to remember it's not so much corruption, but rather the ability of the security forces and the security system and the judicial and penitentiary system to shape the behavior of criminals, This is really what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to dissuade criminals or potential criminals from engaging in the worst kinds of behavior. Certainly, the levels of criminal violence across the hemisphere have been going up. This is one of the few regions of the world where that's true. And I think that, in part, has to do with the inability of the system as a whole, not just military and police, but the whole complex of police, judiciary, penitentiary system, to shape the behavior of criminals and dissuade them from engaging in the most violent and predatory forms of behavior. There's other societies where corruption is quite high. For example, a number of Asian countries have high levels of corruption, but the citizen security piece is not the kind of problem that we see in parts of the Western Hemisphere. So there's some crossover between those two issues, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a direct causal link. Oftentimes, corruption is a reflection of other institutional weaknesses, some of which may express themselves through an inability of the police, judiciary, penitentiary system to do its job in dissuading and shaping criminal behavior to prevent the sort of worst effects on society.
Thank you. Ms. Duma, would you care to comment? Is there a correlation between citizen security and corruption?
I think when we look at this region, there are areas for concern in terms of the citizen security, and I'm going to come at it from the angle of some of the organized crime connections as we pull it in. We touched earlier on Mexico, have all of the facts and all of the connections on that yet. 43 students disappeared last year, and young teachers, in a province of Mexico. It happened to tie to some protests around that could have that were at risk of threatening a local official getting his wife elected. Crime, citizen security, and there are risks to the population. There are dangers taking place. One of the things I would like to see, and as we talk about citizen security, is really that continued focus on the justice sector. And I say justice sector. It's not just the judges. It's not just the prosecutors. It's not just the defense lawyers. By the way, the defense bar, often overlooked when we talk about these conversations for roles that they can play for a credible system. But we need to get the justice sectors right. This is not easy stuff. Nobody has all the answers yet. But there needs to be effective justice systems where we can figure out ways with the prosecutors, the judges, to bring those who are the organized crime figures, those who are the high-level officials acting with impunity. It's one area where I would hope that when we talk about the OAS convention, that it would step up its game on its peer review process.
I'll add one additional comment to that, and it might be a benefit to the members of the audience who are concerned about citizen security and its relation to corruption. Is we've had our own experience in Afghanistan with this issue. In fact, the former ISAF commander, General John Allen, a Marine Corps four-star general, in his outbrief to President Obama, declared that corruption was the single biggest concern for our security efforts in Afghanistan. And as a result, his successor, General Dunford, who's now selected to be the commander of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, commissioned a report. We're going to post this on our webpage and link to it anyway, related to this Hemispheric Forum. It's titled Operationalizing Counter and Anti-Corruption Study. And it's a stark report about how difficult the corruption issues that we were combating in Afghanistan are, and probably a lot of good lessons learned for other countries in the hemisphere who are talking about the same kind of problem. Let's take some questions from this side. Sir.
There have been many... I'm Hawkins Nanton from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. There have been several classical cases of white-collar crime / corruption within the Caribbean region. At times, we've seen where an ordinary criminal may be locked up for as much as stealing a bunch of banana. But on the other hand, people who are engaged in white-collar crimes and corruption, they steal millions of dollars, and it is almost difficult to prosecute them. With the absence of a whistleblowing policy within the Caribbean region, and with the absence of the political will to set policies in place, how can the international community assist the Caribbean region, especially in addressing this particular problem? Because it appears that the politicians within the Caribbean, they will say, we will introduce X policy to address the problem on the political campaigns, but in essence, years go by, and we're not seeing these policies being put in place to address white-collar crime / corruption.
Great question. Ambassador?
Listen, I'd like to come back to Richard's question because I think it partially answers this one. And the reason I agreed to be on this panel is this is exactly the right triangle. And I disagree a little bit with Harold here. I think that impediment to developing broader citizen security and consolidating our democratic governance is absolutely fundamental. And we're not just talking here about presidential politics. I'm talking about lower levels of governments, municipal governments, state governments, how people see their teachers, how people interact with their police. Are they scared of them or are they part of the problem? So in some countries like mine, where the actual crime rates are at historic lows, it's still the number one preoccupation. You go to other countries like Honduras, which has got a homicide rate of nearly 90 over 100,000. I mean, it's not that high a preoccupation because there are some very, very small jurisdictions where it is very difficult to. Maybe it's time to start looking at a regional shared CSIG kind of process.
I won't say anything about the police and military. I'm really out of my league in that debate. But I note some other things, as the ambassador said, that we need to rethink or recharacterize or redefine this question of citizen security in all the sense. We're really talking about the management of neighborhood rights and how we share the neighborhood, the management of access to public goods, make statements against persons who are behaving improperly. And we have to have persons or institutions or agencies empowered to carry the complaints forward. So what you really said is we don't have these things, and we will not address corruption at pretty much any level. Yes, sir.
No, I just wanted to say that I think the point I would make is that just by addressing corruption, you will not automatically get citizen security. Citizen security is also a product of a broader institutional reform, which is, I think, what both Ambassador Blackwell and Ms. Dumont talked about, which is the whole judiciary system, the complex of institutions associated with it, and their ability to address criminal behavior. But that's not only a product of corruption in the system, that's also a product of having the right kinds of resources, the right kind of training, the kinds of laws in place, as we've been discussing. So certainly, I think corruption in those institutions is an important part of the problem, but just solving that will not deal with the larger issue of how does the system address and shape and reduce criminal behavior.
What about this question that Mr. Nanton raised about the inequality of the law? You developed the Rule of Law Index during your time at the World Justice Project. How do we ensure that all members of society and all institutions, in accordance with the definition of rule of law, are treated equally in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
I'm not an expert on St. Vincent and the Grenadines, so I'm going to give an apology for that. I think part of this is saying, where are the shortfalls? How do we think we need to deal with them? And it can involve a very specific look at where things are working, what issues are working and where they're not. Now, where this gets really tricky in justice systems is that some parts of justice systems are among the least transparent. So when you're trying to figure out what happens, is there a corruption problem? Is it a capacity issue? Is it a knowledge issue? In a given case, was the information that was needed not properly collected? So the judge of those in societies to say, we know we want to go to. It's not just going away from, we want to go to. And to get to a better place for our societies, what do we need to do within various issues? Lateral efforts, there are various regional, international efforts. But it is painstaking work. Part of it will come from the society saying, what do we want to do?
Great. Here's a quick...
Before you go into it, may I ask my colleague from St. Vincent and Grenadines, am I correct in my recollection that several years ago a constable arrested the community collection. Not right.
Here's a question from one of our online audience participants. Elias from Honduras asked a question that was already raised. Does the region or do certain countries need their own model of CSIG, which is functioning fairly well in Guatemala, to handle their corruption issues? Who wants to tackle that one? Dr. Kunkunis, I'll throw that one your way. Do we need a CSIG in some countries?
I think that there's a lot of benefits to the CSIG model in providing I think, as Mr. Ma pointed out, it's not that the laws are not in place to address this. That prosecutorial systems, police systems, judges, courts lack the capacity, the encouragement, the kind of, in a sense, spotlight that the international community can put on certain cases. Just police can feel some sense of empowerment, some sense of backup, just some access to resources that gives them additional capacity to prosecute. I mean, obviously, and suddenly start doing a better job, as we've seen in Brazil. So this is really a case-by-case thing where you have to look at the particular. There's really a lot of merit in thinking about how you could do this.
Let's take a question back here.
My name is Marco Fernandez. Countries fighting corruption have been capable of developing. I'm doing my research precisely on corruption in Mexico, and one of many of the Mexican institutions is precisely corruption, a revolving door. When you are in the public sector, then you go to the private one, producing a lot of companies that supposedly you had to regulate, and you didn't regulate correctly because you were looking for a future.
From your experience as contractor general?
I don't know how one addresses the lack of technical capacity. It becomes, as I said earlier, a first requisite. You have to address those issues. If you can't find the capacity and favor, is that we should be looking for more transparency mechanisms, which are not too expensive to implement, But there's another concern. Technical capacity does not have to mean great agencies with a lot of authority. The capacity
in the sense making improvement is associated with accessing a greater additional resources to improve things like technical capacity. So I think there's something to be said for thinking about how the international community provides assistance to develop this kind of technical capacity, because oftentimes, especially for smaller jurisdictions, that's an important source. Just as within federal countries, to improve outcomes against measurable indicators. So I think that's sort of a trend that we are starting to see.
Great point. Ms. Duma?
I just wanted to pick up. I think that the difficult thing with conflicts of interest is how does one actually operationalize it? There can be all sorts of codes. There can be all sorts of standards. There can be Mexico right now with some of the elections that are coming up. And it's the trust to trust, the 3 of 3 disclosures. And I think transparency plays an important role when we think about conflicts of interest. And as I understand it, there's by those who are interested in running for office. One is assets and thinking about some of the conflict of interest questions.
That's a great point, and I'd say from our class discussion this morning in the Caribbean Defense and Security course, not all of the Caribbean nations represented in the course have any Freedom of Information Acts, nor are the public officials required to disclose.
Good afternoon. I'm Shoshana Ellington, police officer from Jamaica. It is my personal belief that tolerance acts, the recent passing of the legislation in Jamaica, the amendment of that was not made available to the police, no training, no operations, or at what point does somebody...
I would probably think not as an example of incompetence, but not corruption. But to make the point a little bit more, you spoke earlier about declaration of assets. And
delaying the ability of the development of the Guatemalans' own judicial system.
I still work for the OAS, so I have to be careful here. But I think in any intervention that I have seen in my, extensive international career, which is not owned by the local authorities and not developed by the local authorities, is invariably not going to be sustainable. And so the answer on CSIG is, we don't know. What happens when it's no longer there is what concerns me. So I just think we need to be very careful that these don't become sort of some kind of implanted solutions on communities that may not want them. It's a bit like a transplant. You've got to make sure that the thing takes.
Thank you. Sir, we're go to the gentleman here in the front row in the red shirt. Thank you for being patient. We'll go to Dr. Daly Hayes right after that.
Okay. My name is Richard Dawson. And what I wanted to ask you is related to the confusion I see between mission and roles. Is the mission of the security forces to shape behavior or to fight organized crime? I think maybe we are confusing mission with roles, and probably the problem is at that level.
Dr. Trinkunis, does the military or the security forces in the region have a responsibility to fight corruption?
I think by and large they do not. I think constitutionally, I'd find very few countries where the military has a role in fighting corruption. I mean, that's a role of the judicial system. That ultimately, I think, going back to this issue of roles and missions, I think that the reason I use the word shape behavior is precisely because to get away from the notion of fighting organized crime. There's always crime. In fact, there frequently is organized crime. The question is, what impact does it have on society? You're not going to be able to uncover all of it, not in our country, not in most countries of the world. So when you try to shape behavior, you're trying to dissuade criminals from engaging in the behavior that is most harmful to society. So ultimately, you are trying to shape their behavior in certain ways, knowing that not all of them are going to be found, not all of them are going to be detected, not all of them are going to be successfully prosecuted, not all of them be successfully convicted and be put in prison. And even if they're put in prison, we have no assurance in many of the penitential systems in the world that they're not actually going to be recruited into even worse activities in the future. So just a healthy dose of skepticism about our ability to go after all crime and some sort of realistic thinking about what we can actually achieve. And in that sense, I do think that the police, and maybe in certain instances where the military is given a specific mission in moments of national emergency within whatever the Constitution establishes, you could imagine that that they'd have particular missions to deal with issues of organized crime, as we've seen, for example, in Mexico. But ultimately, you're trying to all of what we're talking about here is shaping the behavior of persons in society, hopefully so that they have built-in rules that enable them to pursue a positive path, and even those who have attempted to engage in negative activities are dissuaded from engaging in the worst kinds and most predatory kinds of negative criminal kinds of activities. So I'd phrase it that way.
Ms. Duma, do you agree? Do the security forces of a country have a role to fight corruption?
If I put on my rule of law, World Justice Project hat, and some of my other roles, I would agree. I don't think that fighting corruption is a core mission that the security forces have. But they, by their own behavior, can contribute to and enable corruption. So I think that we need to think there's the role, and then there's what impact are the relationships and the behavior of security forces having in contributing to corruption in a country and perhaps perpetuating certain behaviors. So I would put that additional angle or question into the analysis.
Thank you. Dr. Daly Hayes.
Thank you very much. Margaret Daly Hayes. I'm teaching now in the Security Studies program at Georgetown. It's been curious throughout this discussion that there has been no mention of education. And we've talked about behaviors, expectations. Where do citizens learn the behaviors, the expectations of behavior by the police, the expectations about good government, and so forth? Where do or do they? Where do bureaucrats get trained about pitfalls of conflict of interest and so forth? I was struck as Latin American countries begin to adopt an accusatory legal system. In a discussion in Colombia, which was embarking upon that, the new system is not being taught in the university, in law school, which seems to be a bill for having to redo the education. So, is education important? Should we be spending more attention on what children learn, what high school kids learn, the university, and particularly how the law schools are addressing the potential for education?
Thank you for that question. Dr. Trinkunis, you're leading into that one. Dr. McCoy? Dean of the Faculty of Law at UE.
You have virtually nothing to do with education anymore. But there are two components to what you're thinking about. There's the first, of course, is the values and attitudes. How do we create values and attitudes which promote a view of good governance, a view which is opposed to corruption? And that is a broader thing than just a syllabus. It's an issue that we have to promote throughout the broader society. There's the second component, of course, the institutional responsibility. That if we're putting persons in charge of something, they must be trained to manage it. If we put in policemen in charge of security in a city, they must be trained to know they can't stomp people down. It's a part of the training process the police itself, the force itself would have to do. Now, I mentioned, of course, I'm also a little skeptical about the first issue, the intimate issue, the issue about us buying in, because that is difficult, it's complicated. How do we ensure, and what right do we have to ensure that our values are universal? It makes me a little uncomfortable. But I recognize that there are these two needs, and there is a need generally throughout all institutions of society to ensure that the rest of us buy into it. We have to see ourselves as part of the institutions. We have to see ourselves as having a right to certain bits of the neighborhood. And therefore, we need to understand what we need to give, to have a legitimate right to share these things. What do we have to give to have a legitimate right to support from the police? So recognize that broad issue, and I don't think it's the responsibility of educators alone. It's a universal responsibility for the entire society to ensure these values get passed on through all institutions. Secondly, of course, the other part is that institutions who are given persons duties and responsibilities must ensure that they know how to administer them, how to manage their responsibilities and the rights of others.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Margaret, and there really is a one-word answer: yes. An anecdote: I was in a meeting with a president and his security cabinet of a significant country, and he looked at me after about an hour and a half of this discussion, and he said, "Well, what do you think?" I didn't want to abuse the invitation, and I said, "Well, there's some people missing." And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, where's the Minister of Education? How do you develop a broad-based citizen security strategy without building education into the process?"
Ms. Duma, I'm sure you agree. This is your CPI and your Rule of Law Index is an educational tool to inform constituents of what's occurring in their countries.
Yes, they are. I'm going to come at this in a couple of ways, and it's an absolutely terrifically important question. The answer is yes. The values piece needs to be there. How one gets it there, lots of questions. I remember this conversation being raised when I was with the U.S. government 15 years ago when we were talking about Eastern Europe and the former Soviet, and say, how do we make this not just a technical discussion? There needs to be values. How one gets to that, one doesn't want the imperialism of whose values, right values, moral relativism. There's a whole host of discussions one can fall into. I mean, the answer is I think we just need to keep thinking about it. Part of it is where is the role, from a TI perspective, we'll say about civil society. How do we engage people and talk about it's time to make progress forward. In this region, we've had the OAS for 19 years, the MCSIC. there's a lot of profound issues, as our moderator outlined at the very beginning of the session. How do we up our game? How do we talk about no impunity? How do we talk about values? How do we get those changes there? Deal with the illicit economies. I mean, is it time to, how does one harness that and get some positive motion? One of the challenges, bringing in from outside of this region and some knowledge I have when we talk about the formal education system, in some parts of the world, the corruption within the education sector is some of the worst that there is. It is paying to get into the schools. It is paying to get a passing grade. It is paying to graduate. So talking about values and putting it in the formal education sector also says, how does one think about corruption as it is embedded in formal sectors of education, and what messages that sends? Question, not an answer, but it is one of the pieces that we have to think about.
I would just echo this piece of civil society and the fact that what both Derek and Claudia pointed to was the need to have a vigorous debate around this values issue. It's not about establishing one set of values. It's exactly that conversation that I think happens in schools and civil society, in the private sector, in the media. That's a way of ensuring that this issue is sort of transmitted across time. So that clearly is part of it. And also the fact that there is all these cases of corruption that you highlighted at the beginning of the talk, the beginning of this discussion, are in a sense part of getting people to think about these issues of values and responses and what's right and wrong when it comes to issues of corruption. So in a sense, when people raise concerns about, there's all these protesters in Brazil or Guatemala and so on and so forth, actually in a sense that's a feature that people are out there protesting and talking about this issue and caring about it in a very visible way. I think that's an important sign that the society is having that discussion, debate, conversation about what should be the way to do things what's the positive alternative.
Great. Great, thank you. We're almost out of time. We just have a few more minutes left, and I know there's a couple questions in this side of the room. Ma'am, would you like to start? And before we give our panelists a chance for closing remarks.
Netian Gordon, Trinidad and Tobago.
You lost your mic somehow.
Thank you. I took note that it was said earlier on that there may be a chance for a regional ICC within the Caribbean. My question to the panel is, how can the judiciaries, how can the criminal justice system be empowered to deal with corruption where we have in the Caribbean a system of trial that is predominantly a jury trial, where we have persons been accused before the court, are tried by their peers coming from communities where perhaps these proceeds from corruption may have penetrated? How do we deal with it?
Dr. McCoy.
You can't ask as a lawyer to agree to abandon jury trials. It's just impossible. I can't. It's like saying, don't believe in God. These things aren't possible. But we recognize the system is cumbersome. We need to deal with our heritage, what we have. How do we make it work? I mean, I'm not willing, although I must confess, I was about to say, I'm not willing to contemplate a system without jury trials. Although we have, in my own jurisdiction, trials at a high level, a peculiar type of trial at a high level without a jury, what we call the gun court trials, which are trials for possession of a firearm illegally, which does not involve a homicide. So even at the homicide level, it requires a jury, but below the thing, it doesn't. And I'm not sure we're completely happy with the result. I mean, our experience is that in that system, you don't have any more convictions, believe it or not, than where there are juries. I mean, judges are very hard to convince, and when they're sitting by themselves, they're very insecure. They're likely not to come to a decision to send someone away to prison for a very long time if the decision is theirs alone. If it's not theirs alone, they may get some other results. The difficulty we have with juries is that they're hard to manage. They're expensive. It takes a lot of time to summon a panel and to get it done. And that is the difficulty, but I really don't see how we're going to avoid it. Now there's a subtext to the question, which is not confined only to juries. It's confined to any system of public bureaucracy, that where we're dealing with organized crime and money laundering, then the institution is subject to corruption. And that's true in any event. It may be true more when you have jurors, which are more susceptible, more easily attacked, than if you just have a judge. It's easier to get to one of 12 persons, than it is to get just one person who's usually insulated from you. So yes, you face that risk. But like motherhood or family, we live with it. It's a disadvantage we have to accommodate.
Okay. Right here. Last question, perhaps. Maybe we have time for one more.
Damian Madison from Jamaica Police. I've heard the comments on the region, really, and somewhat paints a grim picture of what is. What are there areas, department, states of excellence, what I describe as green areas, where growth has taken place, where we are seeing now where corruption is on the decline tremendously? Are there aspects within the region that is worth modeling, worth looking at this point, and that you wish to highlight with some specific examples of us going in the right direction, especially in the Caribbean?
It's a great closing question.
Let me apologize if I've helped to create this grim picture, because I think the glass is half full. I don't think it's really a grim picture. I mean, the fact that we're not doing very well doesn't mean we're not doing anything. We're doing some things, and we have a hell of a lot more to go. It's not a complete grim picture. We're seeing institutions. We're seeing institutions which are having and will continue to have a positive impact on the issue of managing corruption. We're seeing the role of civil society taking a bigger role in terms of getting the public concerned about these issues. There are some mistakes that we're making, and I don't wish to put a big divide between myself and my friend to my right, but part of the problem we have is that the TI instrument that we have got so accustomed to utilize is really not a good measure. You can't do anything as a society or a country on hiring a good publicist to move yourself on it. But we've got accustomed to using the perception as a measure of whether we're doing well. Perception is perception. If you're measuring corruption, there are other indices we can use. TI has, as I mentioned, has another index which is very, very useful if you're measuring bribery. And maybe it's not outside our capacity to create other instruments to measure if you wish to measure corruption. It's just that we are satisfied with perception. And let me confess. Since maybe it's good, profession is useful. I was a member of Transparency International. I was a founding member in Jamaica. I was a founding secretary. And it was very important in those days, we thought, for TI to do what it's doing now. Not so sure we're right then, but we thought it's a good thing. We needed this approach. But I now see the deficiency of our great reliance. And not only us, I mean institutions at World Bank and so, a great reliance on TI as a measurement. Not fully understanding that perception measures what it says, and that may be useful in many circumstances. It may not be adequate in others. But in the short thing, I'm not unhappy, really. I think the glass is not completely empty. We have some way to go, to be sure, but we're not at rock bottom.
Closing remarks from our panelists focused on that question, if you could. Do you share the optimism of Dr. McCoy? Are we making progress?
My own experiences. I don't know a lot about the rest, all of America, but I'm speaking
Not talking about 34 nations of the hemisphere. Okay, we understand. Do you share the optimism, or is it a tougher, more entrenched problem that we have to fight for generations to overcome?
Sure, it's not Friday. I'm always optimistic. I'm an unsatisfied optimist, and I really think that. What encourages me, we used to talk about the 24/7 media cycle. We're now talking about the instantaneous media cycle as politicians and leaders are trying to react to the Twitter sphere and other social media. And, I see the demonstrations in Brazil and other countries and other jurisdictions as incredibly positive. I mean, I think that as long as they're nonviolent and as long as the reaction of the state is nonviolent, this is a demonstration that the status quo ante is not acceptable, and people want a better future. And as Harold said, we got to start shaping behaviors and shaping the environment that we want to live in. And I have to believe that the bulk of the people in the Americas want to live in safe, sound, and healthy communities. And I think that's what's encouraging to me. It's how we get there and the pieces and the puzzle that we have to put in place to be able to ensure that happens. That's a little more complicated, but we're on the right. I think we're on the right track.
Ms. Duma.
In thinking about the region, I think that there's some good things to be said, and we can debate about the CPI, and I don't think actually we're that far apart. I said it's one tool, it's one measure. It's not going to give you everything. It's one snapshot for maybe some purposes. But when and I'm going to use the CPI, I could also use the Rule of Law Index. If one looks at the Caribbean countries, they're actually doing pretty well when you compare them to the Americas broadly. You heard me say Barbados and the U.S., we're the same under the CPI. I mean, the reality is when we're talking about corruption, it is not an issue that just applies to some countries. It is everywhere in the world. All countries are dealing with this, whether we're talking about France and Bank Paribas, whether we're talking about significant discussions we're having in the U.S. about how do you do campaign finance? Is it corrupting? What do we do about Wall Street? Where are the deficiencies in our court systems? So there is never a point where you say, you're done. But if I look at this region, there are some good stories. And one of those includes, and I'm going to come back to, the freedom of expression, the freedom of association. Keep pushing on those and trumpet those successes and thinking about where you're going, because it's important to have a place not to just get away from, but where you're going to. And I think that's part of the conversation and the visioning that needs to take place in all of these societies is, let's talk about where we're going to get to and what's it going to take to get there.
Dr. Trinkunis, closing remarks?
Just to agree with my colleagues that I do think that there's some reasons for optimism, in addition to the fact that there is variation within the region, and certainly the Caribbean strikes me as doing fairly well in a number of these issues in comparison to the rest of the region. Even within the region, I do think there's reasons for optimism. I completely agree with Ambassador Blackwell that the protests we're seeing around the corruption issues are a positive sign. I think that in the long term, the social change I mentioned at the beginning, the growth of the middle class, the reductions in poverty, shrinking inequality over time will create a broader social base for more cleaner government. I think we're seeing the international community take more conscience of this through efforts like CSIG and through capacity building, which I'd like to see more done about. But there's certainly the kinds of things that are out there that you can look to for examples and as indicators that some of the trends are positive, even though there's some parts of it that do look particularly grim.
Great summary. We covered a lot of different tools today, didn't we, on how to fight corruption in the region. Not just the region, it's a universal problem that all the countries on the globe face. We're going to post a summary of today's discussion on our webpage. Please check chds.dodlive.mil for that report. We will also post links to some of these studies and some of the reports that the panelists have mentioned, including the UN Office on Drug and Crimes 300-page anti-corruption toolkit, a very useful document that contains a lot of recommendations and some of the tools that we mentioned today, Freedom of Information Act, public financial disclosures, whistleblower protections, and a number of others. I want to thank some of the support team here at the Perry Center. Before we conclude, Mr. Mike Mann in the back of the room is the event organizer, put a lot of work into it behind the scenes. Also, our operations and protocol team have been instrumental in putting this together. Our IT team and our outreach team helping to reach our audiences downrange. And finally, our panelists here in the front, Ambassador Blackwell, Ms. Duma, Dr. McCoy, and Dr. Trinkunis. Please join me in a round of applause for an excellent presentation.